Imagine standing on a mountain in Bavaria in the late 19th century. There is no Disneyland, no Hollywood, no computer graphics, no special effects. Only mountains, forests, fog, and above them, a strange white castle rising from the cliffs. Its towers look medieval, its walls seem ancient, its location feels almost impossible. But there is a secret. This castle was not built in the Middle Ages. It was not built for defense. It was not built to control a kingdom. And, perhaps most surprisingly, the man who created it never actually saw it finished. This is the story of Neuschwanstein, one of the most recognizable castles in the world, and the mysterious king who turned his own imagination into stone. His name was Ludwig II of Bavaria. When Ludwig became king in 1864, he was only 18 years old. He was young, sensitive, fascinated by art, legends, music, and the romantic image of medieval kingship. But the real world around him was changing rapidly. Europe was entering the modern age. Railways were transforming travel. Factories were changing cities. New political powers were appearing. Kingdoms were losing the absolute authority they had once possessed. Ludwig, however, seemed to be looking in the opposite direction. He looked toward a world that no longer existed. As a child, Ludwig had spent much of his time at Neuschwanstein Castle, surrounded by paintings and stories of medieval knights and heroic legends. Later, the operas of Richard Wagner had an enormous influence on him. Ludwig saw Wagner's dramatic worlds almost as visions of another reality. In 1867, Ludwig visited the Wartburg, a famous German castle that had recently been restored. Its architecture and legendary history deeply impressed him. And then came an idea. What if he could create his own medieval world? Not simply restore an old castle, not simply build a comfortable royal residence, but create a place that looked as though it had escaped from a legend. Ludwig called the project his new Neuschwanstein Castle. The name Neuschwanstein came only after his death. The location was spectacular. High above the village of Neuschwanstein, surrounded by the Bavarian Alps, the new castle would stand on a rocky ridge overlooking the Polak Gorge. It was an almost theatrical setting, and that was precisely the point. Ludwig wanted architecture to become something more than architecture. He wanted it to tell a story. The castle would contain images of knights, kings, heroes, saints, and legendary figures. Its rooms would draw inspiration from medieval traditions, Germanic mythology, and the world of Wagner's operas. But there was another fascinating contradiction hidden inside the project. From the outside, Neuschwanstein would look like a medieval fortress. Inside, it would contain some of the most modern technology available in the 19th century. Modern engineering, modern heating, a sophisticated kitchen, industrial steel hidden beneath romantic decoration. The medieval castle was, in reality, a product of the modern industrial age, and Ludwig was about to spend enormous amounts of time and money creating it. He imagined that the project would be completed quickly. It would take far longer. In the summer of 1868, workers began preparing the mountain. They removed enormous quantities of rock, in some places as much as 8 meters, simply to create space for the foundations. On September 5th, 1869, the foundation stone was finally laid. The dream had become a construction site, but nobody yet knew that this castle would become something far stranger than Ludwig had imagined. Because Neuschwanstein was not just going to become his refuge, it was going to become his monument, and eventually it would become the place where the story of the mysterious king reached its darkest chapter. The first thing you need to understand about Neuschwanstein is that it was never intended to be an ordinary castle. Ludwig was not trying to recreate history exactly, he was creating his version of history. The difference is enormous. A real medieval castle was designed around practical necessities: defense, storage, water, servants, soldiers, and survival. Neuschwanstein was designed around an idea. It was a stage. Architects, artists, and craftsmen were given Ludwig's increasingly elaborate instructions. Some original designs came from the Munich stage designer Christian Jank, whose theatrical sketches helped shape the appearance of the future castle. Architect Eduard Riedel then transformed these visions into architectural plans, and Ludwig kept changing his mind. The project became more ambitious. A room that had once been planned as a relatively modest audience chamber was transformed into an enormous throne room. Guest rooms disappeared from the plans. A Moorish hall with a fountain was imagined but never built. A writing room was transformed into a grotto-like chamber. The king's dream was evolving faster than the building itself. This created a major problem. Every new idea meant more work, more money, more engineering, more time, and the mountain itself was not cooperating. The workers were constructing an enormous complex on difficult terrain using 19th century technology. Yet the builders were not simply dragging medieval materials up a mountain and stacking stones. They were using modern construction techniques. The foundations were made with cement. The structural walls were built from brick and then covered with light-colored limestone, giving the finished castle its medieval appearance. The illusion was extraordinarily successful, but it was still an illusion. The gateway building was completed first. By the end of 1873, it was ready to be occupied, and Ludwig used the upper floor as temporary accommodation when he visited the construction site. Think about that for a moment. The king had ordered a magnificent castle, but for years he was effectively living inside a construction project. Scaffolding surrounded the buildings. Workers moved through the site. Rooms remained unfinished. Yet Ludwig continued developing his vision. The main palace, known as the Palace, began rising in 1872. Then came one of the greatest engineering challenges: the throne room. Ludwig wanted it to resemble a sacred medieval hall inspired by the legendary world of the Holy Grail. But there was a problem. The huge hall he imagined was simply too ambitious for the existing structure. The solution was remarkably modern. Engineers used a steel construction and then concealed it beneath the historical-looking decoration. It was one of the clearest examples of Ludwig's philosophy. Modern technology could be used to manufacture the appearance of an imaginary past. In January 1880, the Palace finally reached its topping-out ceremony, but the castle was still far from complete. Decoration and technical equipment continued for years. By 1884, several important rooms were finally ready. Ludwig could at last stay inside the castle he had spent so long imagining, but there was something deeply ironic about this moment. The king had dreamed of a perfect medieval sanctuary, yet he entered it in the 19th century. He had created a fantasy of the past using the technology of the future. And even then, Neuschwanstein was not finished. Some planned sections would never be completed according to the original designs. The Bower and Square Tower were only finished later, in simplified form. The castle we see today is therefore not exactly the castle Ludwig imagined. It is the surviving fragment of a much larger dream. And the more Ludwig built, the more complicated his relationship with the outside world became. The castle was supposed to give him freedom. Instead, it was slowly becoming a symbol of his isolation. Because the king was no longer simply building a home, he was building an escape from reality. To understand Neuschwanstein, you have to understand Ludwig II. Without him, the castle makes little sense. With him, every tower and painted wall begins to tell a different story. Ludwig was deeply fascinated by the idea of kingship, but he did not seem interested in being a conventional 19th century monarch. He wanted to be something closer to the legendary kings of medieval stories, a ruler surrounded by art, ceremony, beauty, and myth. His greatest artistic influence was Richard Wagner. Ludwig had encountered Wagner's operas as a young man, including Lohengrin and Tannhäuser. The experience affected him profoundly. Wagner's music transformed medieval legends into enormous dramatic worlds filled with heroes, betrayal, sacrifice, and supernatural forces. For Ludwig, these were not simply entertaining performances. They represented another kind of reality. The king became one of Wagner's most important patrons, and Wagner's mythology found its way into Neuschwanstein. The interior decoration contains scenes inspired by legends and stories associated with the medieval and Nordic worlds, including themes that Wagner had adapted for his music dramas. But Ludwig's relationship with these stories became even more personal. In his later years, he increasingly identified with the legendary figure of Parsifal. the knight associated with the Holy Grail. That helps explain one of the strangest rooms in Neuschwanstein. The throne room was not simply intended to be a place where Ludwig could sit on a throne and receive visitors. It became something closer to a sacred vision of monarchy. The room was designed as a symbolic hall of the Holy Grail. The king was no longer simply a political ruler. Inside his fantasy world, he could become something almost mythological. And this was increasingly important to Ludwig because his real political power was shrinking. The 19th century was not the age of absolute kings. Bavaria had become part of a rapidly changing Germany. After the wars of the 1860s and the creation of the German Empire in 1871, Ludwig's position as a sovereign ruler was increasingly constrained by political reality, so Ludwig retreated. He spent more and more time away from Munich. He increasingly preferred the mountains and his private residences. According to the Bavarian Palace Administration, from 1875 onward, he lived mainly at night and slept during the day. He also arranged private performances in which operas and plays were performed essentially for him alone. His palaces became a carefully constructed fantasy world, and Neuschwanstein was perhaps the clearest expression of that fantasy. It was supposed to be a place where the modern world could be shut outside, but there was a cruel paradox. The more Ludwig withdrew from reality, the more expensive his imaginary world became. Palaces required money, construction required workers. The king's plans became increasingly elaborate, and by the middle of the 1880s, the financial situation was becoming serious. Ludwig's spending had become a political problem. His refusal to change course created conflict with his government. His private fantasy was colliding with the responsibilities of a constitutional monarch. And now the story of Neuschwanstein was about to change completely. The castle had been built as a refuge for a king who wanted to escape the world. But in 1886, the world came to the castle looking for him. On June 9th, Ludwig was declared mentally unfit to govern. A regency was established. 3 days later, on June 12th, the king was arrested at Neuschwanstein and taken away to Burg Palace. He would never return. The following day, Ludwig II died in Lake Starnberg, together with the psychiatrist who had declared him unfit to rule. He was only 40 years old, and the castle he had created as his private sanctuary was suddenly without its creator. But the strangest part of the story was still to come, because only weeks after the king's death, the castle opened its doors to the public. The place that had been designed for solitude became a tourist attraction, the private dream became a public spectacle, and the mysterious king became a legend. 7 weeks after Ludwig II died, Neuschwanstein opened to visitors. It is difficult to imagine a more dramatic reversal. Ludwig had built the castle as a place where he could withdraw from the public. Now the public was entering it. People who had never met the king walked through rooms that had been designed around his imagination. They looked at the paintings. They entered the throne room. They climbed the stairs. They stared through the windows at the mountains. And perhaps, without realizing it, they were walking through the remains of a private fantasy. The transformation was almost immediate. Neuschwanstein was no longer simply Ludwig's retreat, it was becoming an international symbol. Part of the reason was the castle's extraordinary appearance. It did not look like a conventional 19th century royal palace. It looked like someone's idea of a perfect castle. Tall towers, white limestone walls, steep roofs, mountain peaks behind it, forests below, fog drifting through the valleys. Everything about the setting seemed designed for a legend. But the interior was just as revealing. The rooms were not random decorations. They were part of Ludwig's personal mythology. The castle's artistic program drew heavily on medieval legends and the stories connected with Wagner's works. The king wanted the building to express an idealized vision of medieval kingship and Christian symbolism. The Singers' Hall was especially important. Ludwig had been inspired by the Wartburg, where a famous medieval tradition connected the castle with a legendary singers' contest. He wanted Neuschwanstein to have an even grander version. But there is another fascinating detail. The Singers' Hall at Neuschwanstein was not actually intended to function as a concert hall. It was a monument to the idea of medieval chivalry. In other words, Ludwig was not recreating the Middle Ages. He was recreating the idea of the Middle Ages. That distinction explains almost everything about Neuschwanstein. The castle is historical fiction in architectural form. It combines Romanesque imagery, Gothic elements, medieval legends, Wagnerian mythology, and modern 19th century engineering. Its appearance suggests the distant past, its technology belonged to the present, and its purpose belonged almost entirely to Ludwig's imagination. Even the castle's name has a story. Ludwig originally called it the New Hohenschwangau Castle. The name Neuschwanstein was adopted only after his death. So even the name by which the world knows the castle was not the name Ludwig used for his dream. There is also something haunting about the fact that Ludwig never experienced Neuschwanstein as a finished masterpiece. When he stayed there in 1884, the castle still contained unfinished elements. And when he died in 1886, parts of the original project remained incomplete. The Bower and Square Tower were finished only afterward, in simplified form. Some of Ludwig's grandest ideas were never realized at all, so the famous castle that millions of people imagine today is, in a sense, a frozen moment. It is the surviving shell of an unfinished dream. Yet perhaps that incompleteness is part of what makes Neuschwanstein so fascinating. A perfectly completed palace would tell us what Ludwig achieved. Neuschwanstein tells us what he wanted. And what he wanted was enormous. He wanted to escape ordinary time. He wanted to turn legends into architecture. He wanted to create a place where kingship, art, religion, and mythology could exist together. He wanted to build a world in which he could finally feel like the kind of king he believed he should be. And strangely enough, he succeeded, just not in the way he expected. The castle did not preserve Ludwig's private life. It preserved his imagination. And after his death, that imagination began spreading far beyond Bavaria. Today, Neuschwanstein is one of the most famous castles in Europe. Around 1.4 million people visit it each year, according to the Bavarian Palace Administration, with thousands of visitors passing through its rooms on busy summer days. But the real mystery of Neuschwanstein is not its popularity. It is the question of why we are still fascinated by it. Why does this particular castle capture the imagination so powerfully? Perhaps because it seems to exist between two worlds. It looks medieval, but it is modern. It feels ancient, but it was built in the 19th century. It was designed as a private refuge, but became a public attraction almost immediately. It was meant to represent a powerful king, yet its creator died before he could finish it. And perhaps most importantly, it was built by a man who was trying to escape reality. Ludwig II had discovered something that many rulers before him had discovered in different ways. Power does not necessarily create happiness. He was a king, but he could not simply turn the modern world into the world he wanted. So he built another world, a world of towers and legends, a world of knights and sacred halls, a world inspired by Wagner's music and medieval stories, a world where architecture could say what politics could not. Neuschwanstein was his attempt to make imagination permanent, and that is why the castle can feel strangely emotional even today. When you look at it from the mountains below, you are not simply looking at a building, you are looking at the remains of a man's argument with reality. He was saying, in effect, if the world no longer looks like the world I believe in, I will build my own. But there is one final twist. Ludwig wanted Neuschwanstein to be a place of solitude. He wanted to escape the public. He wanted distance. He wanted privacy. Instead, the castle became one of the most photographed and visited landmarks in Germany. The shy king who wanted to disappear created a monument that made him impossible to forget. That contradiction may be the true heart of Neuschwanstein. Ludwig tried to hide inside a fantasy. The fantasy survived him. His political power disappeared. His plans changed. His castle remained unfinished, but the image he created became stronger with time. The mountain, the towers, the cliffs, the forests, and the white walls became inseparable from the legend of the fairy tale king. And there is one final detail that makes the story even more extraordinary. Ludwig never intended Neuschwanstein to become the universal symbol of fairy tale castles that we recognize today. That meaning was created later. The castle became famous precisely because people could look at it and imagine their own stories. Some see a medieval fortress, others see a romantic palace. Some see Wagner's legends, others see the lonely world of a mysterious king. And perhaps that is why Neuschwanstein has survived so powerfully. It does not tell us only one story, it invites us to enter a story. More than 130 years after Ludwig's death, visitors still climb the mountain to see the dream he left behind. They pass through the same halls, they look at the same painted legends. They stand beneath the towers he never saw completed, and for a few moments, surrounded by the Bavarian Alps, it is possible to understand what Ludwig was trying to create. Not a castle, not really. A world that never existed. A world that could not survive in reality. A world that, paradoxically, became real because someone built it. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of Neuschwanstein. The king who wanted to escape history ended up becoming part of it. The man who wanted to disappear became unforgettable. And the unfinished castle he built for himself became a dream shared by millions. Neuschwanstein was never the perfect medieval castle Ludwig imagined. It was something much more human. It was a dream made of stone, incomplete, extravagant, contradictory, and beautiful. And maybe that is why, when the mist rises around its towers and the mountains disappear into the clouds, Neuschwanstein still looks less like a building, and more like a memory of a place that never existed.